Yeah, so I'm Eddie Dempsey, I'm a railway worker. I'm a trade union activist. I grew up in South London, we're an Irish family. I moved backwards and forwards between Republic of Ireland and London a lot. I've got no formal education, worked every job under the sun, all the agency work and everything else. I joined the railway coming up to 12 years ago, and I've been a trade union activist ever since then. I've represented my members locally, regionally, in the national leadership of our union, and also internationally on the European and international federations. Yeah, so my main reasons for voting to leave the European Union would be, first of all, I campaigned with my trade union to leave the European Union, which has always had a position that the European Union and previous iterations of it are a barrier to implementing policies in this country which are socialist in character, such as renationalisation, and also because it's anti-democratic. And fundamentally, if you want to enact policies in the benefit of the majority of people in the country, you need a sovereign parliament and the ability to elect representatives to that parliament with the powers to do that, and the European Union takes that away from us. On top of that, the European Union, apart from just this constitutional and institutional makeup, has been a primary source of anti-trade union legislation, anti-trade union rulings. It's been a source of neoliberal policy, and it makes austerity permanent, which is something we want to escape from. No, we couldn't renationalise the railways within the European Union for a number of reasons. Firstly, we have the EU fourth rail package, which makes competitive tendering of rail services, passenger rail services, mandatory on all member states. Previous versions of the previous rail packages have separated the freight operation from passenger services, the infrastructure, so the tracks, the signals and everything else, stations, from passenger services. So what we've got is a fragmented, so basically the British model of rail franchising, which we've got now, is what's made mandatory by the EU fourth rail package. So within that, you could probably at best have a state bidder to bid in competition with private operators to run one of the franchises. We've got 26, 27, 28 different franchises in this country, plus freight and everything else. And they would have to compete. It would have to be a fair competition. We would be open to litigation if there was what would be considered an unfair award by the British government to a state bidder. So effectively, we couldn't have a nationalised railway in Britain within the European Union, and it's very unlikely we'd get very far in even having many national bidders within that franchising system. And it's worth remembering the Tory government has even gone as far as privatising the state bidder. So even the state bidder, the operator of last resort, which people are saying we could have run rail services within this fragmented competitive system, is already privatised. So we can't have a nationalised railway in the European Union. Well, there aren't any nationalised railway industries within the European Union. People say there are, but they're not. And I've even heard many people in the Labour Party, people who are elected as councillors, saying this, which is really shocking, because it appears they don't understand what nationalisation is at all. So the only country you could probably say is even close to that is Finland, which is less than 5,000 kilometres of railway. People point to France and Germany and elsewhere. None of those industries are nationalised. What they've got is a fragmented system where freight is often run privately, infrastructure is separated from rail operations, and the state bidders that they've got, so the likes of Deutsche Bahn and SNCF, they operate some franchises in a system where private bidders also run franchises. So for example, Arbelio, which is a Dutch part state-owned rail operator, sued the German government or a regional government of Germany, Westphalia, a few years ago, for awarding its regional railway to the national state-operated bidder, and they won successfully. They proved this was unfair competition, and so they successfully sued the regional government of Germany. In France right now, you've got French ministers going through the process of beginning to privatise and sell off lots of their regional railways in order, in their words, to comply with the EU fourth rail package. So there isn't anywhere in Europe that's got a national rail service that's state owned, and those that still have strong state bidders that operate the majority of passenger rail probably all have their freight services already privatised and are now going to be forced to break up those services and put them up to competitive tender when the EU fourth rail package comes in to full force. Well, yes, the EU's pushing privatisation and liberalisation in all industries, really. The most recent example to look at would be postal services. So our post office was privatised under an EU directive, and if you think about a single market, I mean, what's a single market for? I don't know why people can't see. The single market is to have a domestic EU market in as many industries and services as they can, which are liberalised and run privatised. So I can't see it being too far off in the future when they start looking at a single market in health or a single market in education or any of the other areas that we try to protect in the labour movement from market forces. So yeah, there's many industries that the EU's pushing liberalisation in, including ports. You look at ports, they've been liberalised under EU directives. We've seen strikes in Spain and Italy and other places. And yeah, that's really what the purpose of the EU is to drive private ownership of industries, break down national democratic ownership of our services, and really to remove economic and industrial planning from national democracies and to place them away from us somewhere else where we can't elect people to enact policies and where we can't hold those people accountable. And if we don't like what they do, then they simply litigate and challenge us and take us to the European Court of Justice, which rules in favour of the corporations every time. I mean, our own QC, John Hendy, he described the European Court of Justice as a judicial coup d'etat, and he's not wrong, because every time a corporation takes a trade union or a national government to the ECJ comes down on the side of the corporations and against citizens and against trade unions. Well, so what has the EU done to Greece? It's done the same thing to most of the peripheral states. So Greece is the most known example because of the torture really the Greek working class were put through in that country. But effectively, you've got a number of things. You've got the euro, which is a currency that was designed specifically to facilitate austerity and a transfer of public assets and wealth into private hands. So Robert Mundell, the architect of the euro currency, he described it very clearly. When governments enter into crisis, they don't have any of the traditional levers with which to alleviate their debt, so they're forced to sell off any national assets they've got in order to relieve themselves from the debt burden. On top of that, you've got the Fiscal Stability Pact, which is copper-fastened austerity. So what happens in national member states in the periphery, where they've got a currency that's pegged really to satisfy the manufacturers in Germany, when they find themselves in crisis, they've got no way out but to accept crazy loans from the Troika in return for selling off their national assets. The same thing happened in Ireland. We've just seen the EU demanding $3 billion of austerity on Italy. I mean, in Ireland, they forced the Irish government to accept all of the bank debt as sovereign debt. And now, even in Ireland, the country has fought so hard and long for independence, has to have its national budgets rubber stamped in Brussels before it's even debated in its own parliament. So we can really see what the different institutions and mechanisms of the EU are about. They're about forcing these peripheral countries into effectively labour supply countries, markets for manufactured goods from Germany and the core. And when they go into periodical crisis, it's an opportunity for the spivs. And it's you can just see from the attitude the European Union took to Greece. There was all this talk about defects in the Greek character. And you know, the sort of very short-lived resistance the Greeks put up against that really puts paid to the argument that people are saying in this country, extraordinarily, we're going to go back into the European Union and we're going to defy its institutions. I mean, it just shows this is infantile nonsense and detached from reality. Well, I don't think that Brexit will hurt the working class in a way a lot of the people are saying, and I don't think the EU has ever been a force to defend or extend the living standards or rights of working class people anywhere. So the EU is neoliberalism made permanent, and you've only got to look at what neoliberalism has done to Britain and other countries in the European Union over the last 40 years. It's destroyed industry, it's driven wages down, it's driven insecurity, it's eroded living standards, unemployment's through the roof in countries in the peripheries. We've seen youth unemployment hit 40 and 50%. And a lot of the so-called protections people tell us the EU is a defender of is just a load of sugarcoating on what's a very bitter neoliberal pill. So, for example, you've got the Agency Workers Directive. People told us this is a huge piece of legislation that's going to protect those at the bottom of the pile. The Agency Workers Directive comes with a loophole. And what it did was normalise and legitimise outsourcing of labour as an acceptable route of employment. So a lot of these big outsourcing companies like Mighty and G4S, their profits skyrocketed after that legislation came through. Some of it by 200%, it went through the roof. So I don't think the EU is a defender of workers' rights at all. I don't think Brexit is going to hurt the working class. I mean, you hear people talking about things in terms of GDP. I mean, GDP goes up all the time, but the share of that wealth don't ever go to labour, does it? GDP's been going up, but wages are stagnating or going backwards. So I don't see these arguments as being serious from the point of view of people who are working class or having to work at the bottom of the labour market at all. The EU's general, I won't say relationship, but its general attitude to trade unions across the European Union are twofold. Those trade unions that they can mollify and convince through ideas like social dialogue and nonsense ideas around the social charter, all of this sort of stuff. Those trade unions that they can mollify with this sort of talk, fine. Other trade unions who want to defend their members properly, who want to fight for their services in their industries, they're against us. There's been numerous rulings in the ECJ on the side of corporations and against trade unions, like the Viking and Laval case, whereby you had a trade union going on a strike effectively because a shipping company reflagged the vessel, brought in workers on lower rates of pay in terms and conditions than a nationally collectively bargained rate of pay for that work. The union went to go on strike to defend their terms and conditions, not to say that they didn't want workers coming to work in that industry from abroad, but that they believed that workers who were coming to work should have to be paid the national collective bargain rates. And the ECJ ruled against it in favour of the corporation's right of establishment. It's been the same with us, and when we took a challenge to Europe on a question of what they call here secondary picketing, or what we call solidarity strikes, whereby if the St Mary's Hospital goes on strike next to Paddington Station, we feel strongly, we want to come out in their support. That was made illegal in this country. They view it as, the case they made for that was a threat to national security for that period. We were having more strikes here than elsewhere in Europe. We took a case to the ECJ proving the level of strike action in this country was the same broadly as other European countries. The ECJ agreed, basically said that our case or our argument was correct. However, they ruled against it. I mean, it's one of the most bizarre rulings I've ever heard of. And one of the other areas you've got to look at is national collective bargaining. National collective bargaining as a portion of jobs in the labour market that are negotiated for and rates of pay are settled through negotiation with trade unions has fallen dramatically throughout the European Union through this period, and that's no accident. Most of the legislation around EU free movement of labour, for example, isn't at all about individual workers' rights. It's about the rights of corporations to shift labour around, to pit workers against each other, and to drive wages and undermine terms and conditions in a downward direction. So the European Union is a protector of workers' rights. The idea of it is fantastical from a legislative perspective, from social policy perspective, from anywhere else you want to look. It's just a joke. Yeah, so at a recent Lexit event where I spoke, I did two things. First of all, I basically paraphrased the Labour MP I won't mention, who I debated recently, who was effectively analysing who voted leave in a referendum and was saying that the Labour Party could get to power on the backs of seeking the more liberal Remain voters, ethnic minorities across the class spectrum, and could effectively abandon large sections of the working class who voted leave, and it would still be enough to get into power. And I think that was probably a right assessment. I don't think he was wrong, that Labour could get into power on that basis. But what I was criticising was that in the long term, that would be no good for the prospects of a Labour Party in this country, or for the prospects of socialist policy, because the only people in this country that are going to really vote for radical change are going to be working class people. And a Labour Party that is not fundamentally a movement of the working class in this country is on very thin ice as far as I can see it. One of the other comments I'd made was that a lot of the people who are sadly turning out for demonstrations from the likes of Tommy Robinson and the DFLA in a lot of the post-industrial areas, one of the common things that are amongst this type of people is they really hate who they view as the liberal left. And I said they were right to hate them. Not because they're left, but because a lot of the liberal left, if you think of the new Labour years, they participated in the neoliberal policies that deindustrialised their communities, that robbed them of their institutions, which gave them a framework in which to express their political and economic arguments and their dissatisfaction with the world. So if you go to a lot of these places, these communities have been robbed twice. So first of all, the industries these people worked in where they had dignity are gone. Because those industries are gone, so are their trade unions. Their trade union organisation is gone, which would have given these people a framework in which to understand their lives and which to make, their arguments clear in terms of their dissatisfaction with society. That's all been taken away from them. And on top of that, their own Labour Party, for a long time, has been hostile to working class people and feels like a hostile environment for working class people in general. So, unless you went to university and you're au fait with the liberal lexicon of language and so on, it can be quite an intimidating place for people and they don't feel welcome. So where are these people meant to go? So they've been robbed of work, they've been robbed of education a lot of the time, they've been robbed of their trade unions, they've been robbed of their Labour Party and their institutions. So that's how they express their grievances with the world. And the reason I was making those comments is not because I'm in any way favour of supporting Tommy Robinson or anyone else. I spent a decade chasing a geezer around London trying to keep him out of it. The reason I made those comments is because I am concerned about the working class being politically disenfranchised in this country. They have been all of my life. They have been for coming on to 40 years now, and it's been getting worse. And the thing is, if the Labour Party is not organising these people, they're going to go somewhere else, and that is a danger. Just like in a trade union, you would not leave a section of workers unorganised. Unorganised workers can be organised against organised workers. People who are not in our movement in the working class can be organised against our movement. It's in our interests to regain those people and make them part of our movement once again. Not all of them can be one to it. Some of them are too far gone. But you've got to understand the reasons what are driving people in this direction and not simply just write everyone off. I'm no fan of Tommy Robinson or anyone else. There was a lot of comments made about I was talking about a white working class. I don't believe in a white working class because it just obviously doesn't exist. I grew up in London, for example. There's never been a white working class in London. There's always been people here from everywhere. I've always said that too. There are people who are at the core of the far right movement who know what they're doing. They're playing on people's dissatisfaction. They're peddling hatred and division. But what we shouldn't do is gift those far right people who are seeking to sow division and all the rest of it, large sections of the working class by writing them off. That would be a catastrophic mistake for anyone who's interested in actual serious anti-racism or anti-fascist work. Well, their relationship has always been very similar, and that is, it's different language now, but they don't like working class people. They don't trust us. They don't want us politically engaged. They would quite like to have a Labour Party well away from the majority of working class people in this country. They've got a very paternalistic attitude towards us. They don't like it when we speak up. And when somebody does, they like the opportunity to point their finger and confirm all of their prejudices they have about working class people. I mean, to be clear, being working class in this country doesn't mean you're white. and that's because your class is a relationship that's different to, it's a relationship that's based on where you stand economically in the country, and it can be cultural as well. But there are large sections of the country where people are just looked down upon. I mean, people just look down upon, and somebody who votes to leave the European Union, and working class areas where the majority of people support leaving the European Union, they love the idea of just pointing the finger and going, well, it's all because they're bigots. It's all because they've got bad ideas about people who are not from the United Kingdom. When in reality, the real reason the majority of people voted to leave the European Union was on the question of sovereignty. And it might not be catchy. People didn't go into the voting booths going, I'm voting because of national sovereignty. People in this country have been disenfranchised. They know they've had power taken away from them. When they go to work, they've got no strength, they've got no power. They're ordered around in work. When they go to social security, they're treated like scum. When it comes to politics, they're ignored. They know there's a lack of power here, and people want some back, and that is really what sovereignty is about. And that's really what the history of the Labour movement's about. It's been about ordinary people having democratic control over their lives, over their industries, and over their country. And that's what we want. In my view, that's a socialist idea. But a lot of these people in a more liberal Remain, call it left, they see themselves as left and progressive. I don't believe they're progressive at all, because what they really do is just write people off and point the finger and just accuse us all of being bigots. And particularly if you are white from a working class council estate, you must be either a football hooligan or some kind of yob, or your views, particularly if they're anti-European Union. It can't be because you might have a political idea about the nature of democracy or the country at large. It must be because you secretly harbour racist ideas or you hate foreigners. And it's just nasty. They've never liked us, we know they don't, and to be honest with you, it's one of the reasons why we've got to reclaim our movement. More working class people need to get involved in the Labour Party. We need to get into these CLPs, which are talking shops and coffee houses really for, in a lot of parts of the country, for sort of better off professional people. This is our institution, and we need to reclaim it and reclaim our place in it, because they've driven us out of it over the course of many years, and we ought to have it back. Because at the end of the day, that's what the Labour Party was founded for, to represent the working class people in Parliament, and they might want us to forget that. And they've caused enough division in this country where so many working class people now see the Labour Party as being something hostile to them. We've got to change that, and we've got to get it back, and once again make the Labour Party a component of the working class movement towards improving our lives. It can't just be a talking shop for liberals who want to pat us on the head one minute and then call us a bunch of yobbos the next. So would Labour backing the referendum mean the end of the Labour Party as a party for the working class? Well, I think this goes back a little bit further, as I've said before with some of the previous questions. Neoliberalism and the rise of it, the rise of New Labour, really did so much damage to shatter the link between working class people and their historic party in this country. And a good example of that would be my trade union. So Thomas Steels, the guy who sent a resolution to TUC to found a party of Labour, was a member of my trade union. He was a member of the ASRS from Doncaster. If you go through Doncaster train station, you see his plaque. It's up there still. We were kicked out of the Labour Party, effectively. My trade union, the union that founded it, we were booted out of it. And recently we had a AGM, an annual general meeting, to discuss whether we should re-affiliate under Corbyn's leadership. And our members decided, no, we shouldn't, because they didn't fully trust the Labour Party. We like Jeremy Corbyn, we support him and his policies, but we didn't trust the Labour Party, or we didn't think there were enough people in it who had the stomach for the fight to really take it to these Blairites and get rid of them. And that's sort of looking like it's being borne out. Labour looks like we've still got a real hardcore of neoliberals in there who are driving the policy towards Remain in the Labour Party. And I think if Labour do go forward with a party of backing Remain, it will do more to shatter that link than even the years of Blair. Where will those votes go? I don't think they'll go to the Tories. I think they go to somewhere like the Brexit Party. I'll cancel people against that. I know a lot of people who voted and went for the Brexit party in the European Union elections. But effectively that way is a dead end for working class people in this country, because ultimately, even though they're campaigning to respect the referendum to leave, they will not be a party that can or wants to or has got any intention of delivering for the working class in this country either. So working class people have got to remember, the Labour Party, we've got a difficult struggle here, but it's still a party with a link to the trade unions, which is our organisations, even though mine was kicked out and we decided not to go back in. I don't think it will completely write the Labour Party off as a party, but I think it will severely, severely damage not just the prospects of the Labour Party re-engaging with the working class, but that will ultimately damage the prospects of anyone on the left who wants to see socialist policies really enacted in this country, not just words, not just tweets. If you want to see renationalised industries, if you want to see us taking on capital, stopping capital flight, if you want to really see real change in this country, then the only people that are going to vote for that, as we've seen, is the working class, because they're the people who need it most. If we rely on a liberal, Remain-minded set of people quite happy with the status quo, regardless of all the talk about, I've never heard so many people worried about jobs. I mean, unemployment, we've had unemployment here for years. These people have been all of a sudden really worried about jobs and terms and conditions for working class people. They're fair weather friends. These people, really, their homes in the Liberal Democrats and elsewhere, they're not going to be the people who support socialist policies in this country. They're not going to be the people who support radical change. They haven't got the stomach for the fight. So the Labour Party really needs to get behind respecting a referendum and building on those good policies they've got in their manifesto to change the country. In that way, working class people will come back. But if it goes down this road of backing Remain, it's going to do serious damage. And I'll tell you what, I think that suits a lot of the Blairite neoliberals in the party. They quite like the idea of this Remain because, number one, if Labour becomes a party Remain, it's going to lose working class support and it'll make their right-wing policies easier to maintain in Labour. If it supports Remain, it's going to mean it's a cage around any kind of Corbynism. If we end up in the European Union with Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party, then the manifesto's toast. We can't do any of the things in here. There's no progressive policies. We just carry on with privatisation, austerity, and all the rest of it. So it just suits them to keep this position up. So it should be for people who really want socialist politics and the left to win in this country, should push the Labour towards leaving the European Union, recognising, respecting the referendum, and really fighting for socialist politics instead of trailing on the coattails of Liberal Democrats and Blairites. So what do I want to see happen with Brexit? I mean, it's not controversial. I want us to do what we voted to do, which is to leave the European Union and its institutions, which I think will be a huge benefit for the Labour movement in this country as a whole. The entire history of our movement has been about working class people in their organisations taking democratic control of our economy, of our government, of our industries. We can't do that in the European Union, and I'm fearful, even if we stay, for example, within a customs union, what that would mean for us. I mean, why would we want people that we haven't elected, that aren't accountable to us, negotiating trade deals on our behalf with America or anywhere else? We've just seen the whole TTIP thing going on. I don't want to see a rerun of that. I want any trade deals that are negotiated in this country to be negotiated by people that are democratically accountable to us, with a mandate, and people we can get rid of if we don't like what they're doing. What will happen if we don't carry out Brexit? I've said this many times. If we don't deliver on this referendum, it will be the biggest recruiting sergeant for the right that you've seen. I said this way before Nigel Farage came back out of the woodwork. I remember there was a demonstration of the far right in London, the DFLA, the Football Lads Alliance, far right march in London. And I saw people screaming, this is the 1930s. It's all like it's the 1930s. We've got to do something. But the following week, there was thousands upon people coming down from Hampstead Heath and coming up from Brighton and everywhere else with the Birkenstocks on and, all the rest of it, marching to overturn the referendum that people voted in to leave the European Union. And I said, if you think the 1930s is going to come from, a few thousand right-wing football fans with regional accents and not from overturning a democratic mandate of 17.4 million people, you need your head testing. Because you've gifted the democratic argument now to the far right. How can you be in a position where the only people speaking up for respecting the referendum are the far right? This is a catastrophic miscalculation on the left, and you can see this happening throughout Europe. The only wherever the left is in Europe that are still championing the European Union as an institution that's progressive, they're getting slaughtered. Where the right wing in Europe are championing national democracy and giving people the hint that they could get some democratic control back, they're on the rise. It seems to me obvious. People understand the European Union is something that is taking away democratic accountability, it's taking away power from them, it's removing decision making from them. They understand that. It's making them poorer. They understand that. And they've got no say in it. So it should really be the left-wing case in this country to say people who live in this country, ordinary working class people, should have a democratic say on whether we own our railways or don't, whether we own our energy industry or not, whether we let the financiers play casino with our economy or not, who runs our country, and the ability to get rid of them if we don't like them. So it should be us doing that, and I think it's going to be a real danger. If we don't, you're going to see the creep and the rise of the right, as you've already seen. I mean, from a standstill, the Brexit party absolutely bulldozered through the European elections, and you've got people covering their eyes, putting their fingers in their ears. And this is my worry, because the working class people in this country need to be in the Labour Party. The right-wing people in the Labour Party, they're quite happy for us to be out of it, and they're quite happy for working class people to be putting their votes somewhere else so they can point the finger and go, look, they're just a bunch of bigots anyway. And that's the problem we've got. The biggest recruiting sergeant for the far right in this country is going to be if we don't deliver on the Brexit referendum. And those of us who campaigned to leave never thought they'd let us go. We saw what happened in Ireland twice. We saw what happened in France. There's never been a popular vote against the institutions of the European Union that's been respected. Every single one of them has been overturned. People know that, and we're sick of it. It's been too long now, and people want some say over their lives. And that's the general feeling. If it's not the left that's championing that idea and pushing for us to take control of things, then it's going to be someone else, and it's going to lead to disaster.